into the 20th century. As a new century approached, more people began working for social change in Illinois. In 1889, Jane Addams began helping poor women and children in Chicago. She opened Hull House, which was a place where people in need could come for assistance. Families could find medical care there. Children attended classes. Adults could get help finding jobs. Everyone could use the library, gymnasium, and art gallery there. Adams also worked to pass laws that would protect children. In 1883, the state passed a law that required children to attend school. In 1903, Illinois limited the number of hours children could work in factories. In 1931, Adams received the Nobel Peace Prize for her work. She was the first woman to win the important prize. Fighting for rights. In 1920, the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution finally gave women full voting rights. An organization called the Women's Christian Temperance Union led the campaign to give women the right to vote. In the picture, you can see Jane Addams. She's pictured there with children at the Hull House. Residents of the house organized the first public playground and kindergarten in Chicago. Children at work. Employers in the 1890s and early 1900s looked for people who would work for little pay. They often turned to children. Children as young as 6 years old worked in the stockyards and factories of Chicago and other large cities. Their workday might last as long as 14 hours, but they were often paid less than $1 for a day's work. Children of poor parents had to help their families survive. They often lived in crowded tenements with few windows and little fresh air. Some poor families shared apartments with several other families. The Women's Christian Temperance Union was based in Evanston, Illinois. In 1913, Illinois became the first state east of the Mississippi River to allow women to vote for president. In 1916, more than 200,000 Illinois women voted in the presidential election. Others fought for their rights at the same time. Thousands of African Americans moved to Illinois from the South between 1910 and 1950. This became known as the Great Migration. They came looking for jobs in the many new factories. The United States entered World War I in 1917. Illinois factories expanded to produce goods for the war effort. African Americans found jobs in Illinois cities that they couldn't find in the South. African Americans still faced injustice in the North. In East St. Louis, white workers became angry when African Americans took jobs from striking workers. Tensions between African Americans and whites led to violence in several Illinois cities. Race riots broke out in Springfield and in East St. Louis. In 1919, rioting broke out in Chicago. It started on July 27th when an African American teenager swam too close to a beach where only white people were allowed. After 5 days of rioting, 38 people were dead and many more were wounded or left homeless. The picture on the left is Oscar De Priest, who was elected to the United States Congress in 1928. His father had actually been a slave. To protect their rights, African Americans began electing their own leaders. In 1928, Oscar De Priest was elected as the first African American congressman from Illinois. Reforming Illinois. Illinois also took steps to make the state a healthier place. For years, people in Chicago had unsafe drinking water. The Chicago River flowed into Lake Michigan. Garbage in the river polluted the drinking water in the lake. In 1900, the state completed a remarkable project to fix that problem. The Sanitary and Ship Canal opened south of Chicago. It ran 28 miles and connected the Chicago and Illinois rivers. When it was completed, the canal was the second largest in the world. Now, instead of flowing into Lake Michigan, the Chicago River flowed south into the Illinois River. As a result, Chicago is able to enjoy safer drinking water. Illinois workplaces became cleaner and safer too. The huge meatpacking plants in Chicago were very unclean. As a result, the meat sometimes made people who ate it sick. In 1906, Upton Sinclair wrote about life in a meatpacking plant in the novel The Jungle. He showed the world just how awful conditions in these plants were. The picture on the bottom shows the Sanitarian Ship Canal. It opened in 1900. It changed the flow of the Chicago River. To this day, the river is said to flow backwards. Chicago's 45 movable bridges let tall ships pass under and down the river. Sinclair became known as a muckraker, which is a writer who wants to expose corruption or unclean conditions. The Jungle created public alarm about the way meat was prepared at the plants. As a result, Congress passed laws that forbade unsafe and unclean food packaging. Another effort to change society for the better did not work out as well. In 1919, the 18th Amendment to the Constitution outlawed the manufacture and sale of alcohol. The new law was called Prohibition. People did not stop buying alcohol, instead they depended on criminals to supply it. Criminals formed gangs and used violence to protect their illegal business. Chicago became famous for the gangsters who boldly broke the law. One of the most famous gangsters was Al Capone. In 3 years in Chicago, 360 people lost their lives in gang violence. Al Capone was finally convicted and sent to federal prison in 1932. Prohibition ended in 1933 with the 21st Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The picture on the left shows Al Capone. He was known as Scarface because his left cheek had a scar from a fight. He was finally convicted in 1931 for trying to avoid paying his income taxes. The Great Depression. By 1933, Illinois and the rest of the nation were deep in the Great Depression. The Depression was one of the worst crises in the nation's history. It lasted from 1929 until about 1940. Businesses failed and banks closed. Millions of people lost their jobs and life savings. In Illinois alone, 1.5 million people lost their jobs. Coal mines shut down, and half of Illinois miners were out of work. The Illinois Central Railroad fired 30,000 employees because people stopped using the railroad. Without the railroad, farmers were unable to sell their crops. In cities and on farms, many Illinoisans fell into poverty. President Franklin Roosevelt tried to provide relief from the hardships of the Great Depression. He called his plan the New Deal. Roosevelt changed the way banks operated. The savings of common people would now be protected. He created new programs to put people back to work. In 1933, Roosevelt formed the Civilian Conservation Corps. The Corps worked to beautify state parks and other places. The Works Progress Administration was formed in 1935. It built new parks, roads, and bridges. There were also artists who created beautiful murals in public schools and post offices. The picture on the top shows bread lines in Chicago in 1931. They weren't very uncommon sights during the Great Depression. Many people lost their savings during the Depression. In Illinois, about 1.5 million people lost their jobs. Soup kitchens and cities helped provide food for the poor. The picture on the bottom, the Civilian Conservation Corps workers built the lodge, which is below, at Starved Rock State Park. World War II. Illinois and the nation recovered from the Great Depression slowly. Another crisis came in 1941. The United States entered World War II that year. Almost 1 million Illinois men and women joined the armed services. About 24,000 of these lost their lives in the war. Illinois farms and factories worked overtime to support the war effort. The Pullman Company switched from making railroad cars to building tanks. The International Harvester Company stopped making farm equipment and made gun carriages. The Elgin Watch Company made bomb fuses. Plants in Moline, Savannah, Crab Orchard, and Kankakee supplied weapons. Scientists in Illinois worked on a top-secret war project. They hoped to create the world's first atomic bomb. This would be the most powerful bomb ever made. Experiments that helped make the bomb possible were conducted by scientist Enrico Fermi. Fermi worked in a laboratory beneath the football grandstand at the University of Chicago. Very few people knew about this experiment, but they were important to the war effort. In 1945, the U.S. dropped an atomic bomb on each of the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The destruction was horrible, but the event helped to end the war. At the very top, it talks about helping the war effort. Illinois civilians pitched in to help their country during World War II. Crops from Illinois farms fed soldiers and sailors. To produce more vegetables, more than 1 million people started gardens called Victory Gardens. They sprouted on empty lots, along railroad tracks, and even on rooftops. People also recycled scrap metal that could be used to make ammunition. The people of Peoria collected a huge pile of aluminum they named Mount Aluminum. And on the bottom, many women worked in factories making weapons for World War II. These 3 women below are working on aerial torpedoes in 1943 at the International Harvester Company plant in Chicago. The post-war era. During World War II, Illinois colleges provided training for people entering the armed services. After the war, the U.S. government helped pay for college education for veterans. Thousands of soldiers returned to Illinois and enrolled. Many new colleges and universities were formed after the war. Some were created by the state of Illinois. Suburbs grew quickly as veterans bought houses. Cars became easier to afford, and people could move from cities and have more space. Suburbs also offered new schools for children. After World War II, Illinois became an even more important transportation center. Up at the top, you can see Enrico Fermi. He was doing research at the University of Chicago to help make the atomic bomb possible. The element fermium was named in his honor. And then at the bottom, Illinois' Golden Arches. In 1959, a new restaurant called McDonald's opened in Des Plaines, Illinois. Before long, there would be thousands of McDonald's restaurants all over the world. They were the idea of a salesman from Oak Park named Ray Kroc. He went into business with the McDonald brothers of San Bernardino, California. Today, McDonald's headquarters are in Oak Brook, Illinois. The company operates a school called Hamburger University, where McDonald's managers receive training. So going back up where it talks about Illinois becoming an even more important transportation center. In 1946, O'Hare Airport opened in Chicago. The airport soon became one of the world's busiest. In 1959, the St. Lawrence Seaway opened. This was a water route that ran from the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean. It allowed large ocean-going ships to sail to Illinois, which helped the economy. Farm production in Illinois grew after the war. New technology and machinery made it possible to grow more and work more land. However, only large farms made enough money to pay for the machinery and technology. Many small farmers went out of business, and remaining farms became even larger. At the top, you can see a picture of O'Hare Airport. It was named for a World War II U.S. naval pilot named Edward Butch O'Hare. O'Hare won a Congressional Medal of Honor for his bravery during the war. Soybeans were introduced to the United States from Asia in the 1930s. Champaign County became the leading producer of soybeans in the country. Today, Illinois farmers grow about 354 million bushels of soybeans each year. Of course, corn remains an important crop in Illinois. In fact, McLean County is the top corn-producing county in the nation. The picture at the bottom says today soybeans are an important crop in Illinois. They have become a popular part of people's diets. Soybeans are used in tofu, and soybean oil is used to make ink, soap, and other products.